Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is our last of the four-part series. So we're learning about the last part of Shabbat, what we do on Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night, which is Havdallah. So very fitting for our last session together, learning about the mitzvot that take place at home on Shabbat. First source. So here's a verse from the Torah that I think alludes to the idea of what we're trying to accomplish with Havdallah. From Genesis 1. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. So separation was integral, is an integral part of creation. To have any definitive quality, something needs to be distinct from what it is not. Like light and darkness, day and night, land and the water, etc. During creation, so too God separated between Shabbat and the other 6 days, the 6 days of labor and creation, and then the day of rest, the Sabbath. So let's take a look at the last blessing of the four blessings that we say during Havdallah, which is actually the blessing itself of Havdallah. It's the blessing of the separation. So the source number 2 is from the Siddur. It's the translation of the last of the blessings of Havdallah. Blessed are you, God, our Lord, King of the universe, who separates between the holy and the profane, between the light and the dark, between Israel and other nations, between the 7th day and the 6 days of the week. Blessed are you, God, who separates between the holy and the profane. So when we're transitioning from Shabbat to a weekday, at the time of this bracha, when we're making this blessing on Saturday night, why now are we making a point about the uniqueness of Shabbat? Shabbat just ended a few minutes ago, and now we're saying how Shabbat is distinct from all of these other things. So it's not to say that the week is bad and Shabbat is good, and now we're entering something negative. That's not what I believe it to be. I think that would be an oversimplification. So the week, besides having the value of being a time in which labor and creating are permissible, it's also the counterpoint to Shabbat that gives Shabbat its unique quality. Without the other 6 days, there would be no distinct quality to Shabbat. Without 6 days of creating and trying to actively enhance the world and contribute to the world, there wouldn't be this day of rest that's distinct in its own entity. Okay. Source number 3. It is a positive mitzvah from the Torah to sanctify the Sabbath day with words. So says Scripture explicitly, remember the Sabbath day, and it needs to be remembered as its entry with Kiddush, and at its entry with Kiddush, and at its leaving with Havdallah. So here, Havdallah is linked to the commandment of remembering Shabbat. By this understanding, that's what this mitzvah has to do. It has to do with Zachor Yom Shabbat, has to do with Havdallah as well, in addition to we already learned with Kiddush. And later we'll ask the question of whether Havdallah is actually a part of Shabbat, or is it something separate? Is it its own thing? Is it after Shabbat and not really linked to Shabbat? So we'll have to look at that question, and there'll be some halakhic implications of that. But I think it's just an interesting thing to keep in our minds. But either way, the source is saying that it shares a connection with Kiddush, and because of that has to do with the remembering the Sabbath day is supposed to be done when it enters and when it leaves. So we'll learn a little bit more about that, but I just want to keep that idea in our heads about whether it is or isn't part of Shabbat and what that means. Okay, and then one more source, just kind of another general source about Havdallah. This one kind of a halakhic source to explain how we do it practically. And also, it begins with a little helpful acronym, so now you'll never forget, again, the order of Havdallah. Okay, the order of Havdallah: wine, spices, candle, separation. Its acronym is Yabne. Yayin, Bisamim, Ner, Havdallah. So that's wine, Yayin. Bisamim is the spices that we smell. Ner is the candle that we gaze at and look at the reflection. And Havdallah, which is the blessing that we looked at in source 2. The actual blessing that is Havdallah is the separation. And one must be careful that the cup is not spoiled. And then the Ramah, the Ashkenazi gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, adds, and it's customary to say before Havdallah that is done at home, behold the God of my salvation, the cup of salvation I raise, the Jews had light, and as a good omen. So these are the way we have Havdallah at home in our Siddur, is the way that the Ramah is describing here, which is that it begins with these verses that invoke this nice kind of imagery, and they're just very pretty kind of verses from different excerpts in Tanakh. I'll continue. And at the time of Havdallah, one should look at the cup and at the candle. and it's customary to spill a little wine on the ground before one says the blessing so that the cup will not be spoiled. The reason for spilling the wine, because it is said, any home where wine is not poured out like water is not blessed. So we do this as a good omen at the beginning of the week, and we pour some from the cup after Havdallah and extinguish the candle in it because the delight of the mitzvah. So this is the way we do Havdallah today. We have verses from Tanakh that I mentioned that invoke this positive kind of memory and imagery. The Ramah also kind of brings in these, I think, spiritual, Kabbalistic elements of how are we recognizing or hoping for good omens. How are we trying to bring a positive, good energy, maybe some of the energy of Shabbat into the week ahead of us, that this is actually formally the beginning of the week. The week starts Saturday night. Maybe we don't think about it that way. But that's what it would be according to the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar. So just giving you some both the practical, how to do it, what's the order, and then here's this other kind of the values that we're trying to bring into Havdallah. What is it trying to accomplish? What is it we want to say about what it means for the start of our week, and what from Shabbat are we trying to bring into our week? Okay, now I want to look at each element on its own. So we'll start with the wine, yayin, wine. And here's an excerpt from the Talmud, source number 5. What does Rabbi Simon make of the statement, he shall abstain from wine and strong drink? He requires it to prohibit wine, the drinking of which is commanded, as well as wine, the drinking of which is optional. What is this wine, drinking of which is commanded? The wine of Kiddush and Havdallah. He is bound by the oath taken on Sinai. So here, this source is from Masechet Nazir, which has to do with the Nazarites. So someone who's taken a very special oath, taken a biblical oath to refrain from wine. The Nazir also can't cut his hair. Samson was a Nazir. Maybe that's a biblical reference maybe that we're familiar with. So Rav Shimon says that this particular verse about the Nazarite, who takes this oath, like we said, and including refraining from wine, comes to teach that the Nazarite shouldn't have any wine, including that of important rituals. So not just wine that he wants to have, also wine that's associated with important Jewish rituals he also cannot have. He goes as far as to say, Rabbi Shimon, that the mitzvot of Kiddush and Havdalah over a glass of wine go all the way back to Sinai. I think a very strong statement. So really a strong tradition for doing that in this way, for doing it over a glass of wine. But the question should be asked, was it always over a glass of wine? Is this always the way that Havdalah was done? So let's take a look at that by looking at source number 6. At first, the rabbis placed Havdalah as a part of the Amidah in the evening service. When the people became richer, they arranged for it to be said over a cup of wine. When the people became poor again, they again fixed it in the prayers, and they said, he who pronounces a separation in the prayers must do it again over the cup of wine. So what is this referring to? What is this referring to, Havdalah in the prayers? So maybe you've noticed in the Mariv for Motzei Shabbat, so Mariv at the conclusion of Shabbat, so it's the first weekday prayer of the week. There's a special insert into we have always the Amidah, the first 3 brachot, and then the whole middle section, and then the end section, another 3 brachot at the end. And the first few and the last few are always the same, but the middle ones change, and we have a weekday version, we have Shabbat version. So the 4th blessing of the weekday Amidah, of this Mariv weekday Amidah on Saturday night, we add a little text in, which is a text about Havdalah. It uses a similar kind of language as that bracha of Havdalah does. So it used to be that the rabbis put it into the Amidah. We still have this of the evening service. And when the people became richer, they wanted them to say it over wine too. They wanted it to be this separate ritual done at home over a glass of wine, and then also with these other elements that are going to come later. When the people became poor again, they said, just do the one in your prayers. And then when the Jewish people were able to again, this is from the Talmud, so this is all happening a very long time ago. This is not talking about modern Jewish history of different struggles of the Jewish people. But this is what we have now. We have it both ways. So we have this Havdalah text that's in our Mariv Amidah on Saturday night, and we also have it over a glass of wine, and it's supposed to be both that you do. If someone doesn't pray Mariv, though, it's okay for the one on the glass of wine can count it as their Havdalah fully. But we all do the one with a glass of wine. So there's accommodation here. Ideally, Havdallah should be said over a glass of wine, but the rabbis throughout the tumultuous Jewish history at times had to account for the people not being able to afford that. So when circumstances are good, we say it in both settings. We say it Havdallah as an addition to our Mariv Amidah, and then we say it again over a glass of wine as its own separate ritual. Source number 7 from the Shulchan Aruch. You can make Havdallah on beer if it is Chomer Medina, and this is the case for all other drinks except for water. We are accustomed to make Havdallah at the end of Pesach on beer and not wine, as it is more precious to us. So what is this idea of Chomer Medina? It means something that is considered a nice drink in a given locale, something that people drink not just for thirst, but also for enjoyment. This could be whiskey or beer, or a non-alcoholic beverage as well that one really enjoys. So we learned a little bit about this when we learned about wine for Kiddush, when we said that Friday night has to be wine or the challah if you don't have wine, but no other drinks. And then Saturday can be any drink, and also has the same rule of Chomer Medina. It should be something that's nice, that you really appreciate. And I think the Ramah, in his edition in source 7, the highlighted part, really makes that point clear when he says that specifically after Pesach, there's this tradition to do it on beer because you didn't have beer this whole time. Maybe you were really craving it, and now you can really appreciate it. And something's very special about that immediately, as soon as you can, right when Pesach goes out, to have Havdallah on beer is something really special. You're really appreciating the time that you've reached. You're appreciating what the past week was and what now is permissible to you, and can really enjoy that. And that's something that's integral to Havdallah, that there should be a lot of things about it, make the message clear that there should be this enjoyable experience. Okay, next section, the next bracha would be on the besamim, the spices, the fragrant herbs that we smell. Source 8. As Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, the Holy One, blessed be he, gives a person an additional soul on Shabbat Eve, and at the conclusion of Shabbat, removes it from him. As it is stated, he ceased from work and was refreshed, vayinafash. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish expounds the verse as follows. Since he ceased from work, and now Shabbat has concluded, and his additional soul is removed from him, woe, vai, for the additional soul, nefesh, that is lost. Vai, nafash, right? It's somewhat of a play on words, a very sweet point. This idea of this neshama yetera, this additional soul that was with us on Shabbat, leaves us on Shabbat evening, and this is like a spiritual loss for us that we feel. And in some way, Havdallah is coming to aid in this. The next source will explain that, but just one more point about this source. Maybe people have heard like someone say, oy vavoy, that is actually, so vai, oy, it's Talmudic in origin, so now you know that Jewish people have been saying that for thousands of years. Okay, source number 9. If you don't have spices, you don't have to go looking for some, because we only bless them to revive the spirit which is pained at the exiting of Shabbat. So the fragrant spices we bless and smell as part of Havdallah are there to revive the spirit, so that we said that loss of that additional spirit that's with us on Shabbat is hard for us spiritually, that loss. So spices, the fragrant herbs, come as a way of aiding us in that process of that loss. The Mishnah Berurah here, a more modern halachic source relative to the other ones we're looking at, early 20th century or late 19th, early 20th century. He's giving a very technical halachic answer here, right? He's saying that you don't have to, so if you find that it's time to make Havdallah and you don't have spices anywhere, you don't have the fragrant herbs, anything that you can use for besamim in your home, you don't have to go out and looking for them. Why? Why is it that you don't have to go out and seek them? What he's really saying is that it's not an integral part that inhibits us from being able to do Havdallah, right? It's only there to serve as the refreshment for our soul, to bring us this energy that was the spirit that was lost from the additional soul of Shabbat. So, and that's why it was instituted into Havdallah, and that's why it gets its own bracha, that we say a bracha on fragrant smells that we enjoy, and it was added to the structure of our Havdallah at home. But it doesn't make it so that you can't do Havdallah. Really doing Havdallah is that last bracha, that Havdallah, the blessing on the separation itself. So it doesn't make it so that you can't do it. It's just the rabbis added it to address this spiritual concern. Okay, moving on. Ner, the candle. Shulchan Aruch says, it is preferable to bless over a torch. And there is one opinion that if you don't have a torch, then you have to light another candle for Havdallah aside from the candle that is being used to light up the home. And the Ramah adds, a candle that has 2 wicks is called a torch. So what does this mean, this word that he uses? It needs to be something that's specific and distinct for Havdallah. You're making a blessing on what fire provides for us. So we say that it needs to be something with at least 2 wicks to make it distinct. And that's what it means, a torch in this context. So if you only had single wicked candles, let's say, and you want to make Havdallah at home, what would you do? You would actually hold 2 together. If you don't have a Havdallah candle, you can hold 2 candles together so that their wicks join together, and then it is this ideal torch for making Havdallah. Okay. But I'm sure, as everyone's seen, all Havdallah candles are always multi-wick, often more than 2 even. So Havdallah candles are made with this in mind. They always meet the requirements given in the halacha here. Source number 11. It is customary to look. The reason is that one can distinguish the light between each finger. And similarly, we look at the fingernails to see if one can distinguish the light between each finger, like one can distinguish between the nail and the flesh. And furthermore, because fingernails are a good omen, because they grow forever. And we look at the palms of hands because the lines on the hand have an omen that can be blessed. So maybe people have done this or seen this at least. When making the blessing on the candle of Havdallah, we look at the reflection of the candle's light in our nails. It's a very common practice to do and outlined here in this source. And why is that? One is because now with fire, you can appreciate that you can distinguish between things. So you can distinguish between one's nails and the rest of the finger. And also there's something of a good omen here that's expressed just in the nails and hands, and the light that we want to bring into our week also. We could see its reflection. We're blessing fire for the light it creates, which is allowing us to be discerning, to be discerned between fingernail and finger, or anything that fire affords us, that fire is such an important resource for us. So a little bit about how that came to be, that appreciation for fire and for light. So let's look at this source from Bereshit Rabbah, the Midrash. And Elohim blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. This is source number 12. He blessed it with light. Because the sun began to set on Friday night and the light began to shine, all began to praise. Rabbi Levi, in the name of Rabbi Zera, said, 36 hours the light shined, 12 on Sabbath eve, 12 on Shabbat night, and 12 on Shabbat day. When the sun then began to set at the end of the Sabbath and it began to get dark, Adam became afraid. What did God do? He appointed for Adam 2 flints, and he struck one against the other, and light emanated from them. And Adam made a blessing on it. What did he say? Borei meorei ha'esh, who creates light sources for fire. What do we say? Why do we say this blessing at the end of Shabbat? Because this was the beginning of its creation. So this source brings additional reasons for blessing fire at Havdallah, and it says that the blessing that Adam Harishon, the first man, Adam, made was actually the text of the blessing that we make, Borei meorei ha'esh. So it says first, because according to the Midrash, Motzei Shabbat was when fire was created. And second, because this was done to give comfort and security to Adam, the first human being. So the light was always shining. He had never seen darkness like the darkness that came at the end of Shabbat. The light was going for all 36 hours before that. And he became afraid. So God provided him with the ability to make fire in order to comfort him and provide for him, and give him the safety and security and what he needed to meet his needs as well. And Adam made a blessing on this. And this is what we're invoking this because of the blessing of fire that we're not allowed to use. We're not allowed to use it on Shabbat. And now we are immediately when Shabbat is over. So we appreciate that blessing. That's also an aspect of weekday being good, right? Something that we is a prohibition on Shabbat that now we have access to that's really important for our lives. shows that it's not this clear dichotomy of Shabbat good, weekday bad, because there's something very good and positive and this comfort that we can have from something that's only permissible during the week. But also it's to like invoking this historically that that it says here in this midrash that was the first creation of fire was on the first Motzei Shabbat, the first evening after the first Sabbath. So we're also doing it as a remembrance for that. Okay, moving on. Source number 13, just one source about women in Havdallah, because that's something that's come up in a few of our other shiurim. When we looked at Kiddush, we asked this question, and we said there that it's permissible. Havdallah, because of the questions that we talked about earlier in this shiur, Havdallah brings up some interesting questions. Let's read this source number 13. And the Maggid Mishnah writes that there are those who disagree that Havdallah is a Torah commandment and that it is only rabbinic. The practical difference in this is whether women are obligated. If it is a Torah obligation, then women are obligated because they are equally obligated in all the biblical positive mitzvot of Shabbat. If it is rabbinic and not dependent on the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat, rather it is a standalone mitzvah in its own right, and it is a time-bound positive mitzvah, then women are not obligated. And because of this, the Ramah wrote, therefore a woman should not make Havdallah herself, rather she should only hear it from a man. And this concerns where she is exempting men from their obligation, as perhaps his is a Torah obligation, hers is only a rabbinic one. And it is better that she hears it from a man, but it is obvious that if she has no one to make it for her, she can make Havdallah herself. So a bunch of questions come up in this source about the status of Havdallah. Is it biblical? Is it rabbinic? Is it part of Shabbat, or is it something separate? In conclusion, we say certainly a woman can make Havdallah for herself and for other women. We have a question about whether she can make it for a man. If it's a biblical positive mitzvah of Shabbat, she would be able to make it for a man, because then they would both have the same level of obligation, which, as we previously learned, that's the important variable in determining whether one person can perform a mitzvah on another person's behalf, whether or not they have the same level of obligation. However, if they have different levels of obligation, or if it is not part of Shabbat and is therefore not in the typical category, therefore it would be in the typical category of time-bound mitzvot that women are not obligated in, then she would not be able to perform on a man's behalf. So this is a question that I think the different sources have different answers, but it kind of remains a question nonetheless, that we don't really know to what extent is it connected to Shabbat or not connected to Shabbat, to what extent is it a biblical mitzvah like Kiddush or not. But it's just interesting, I think, the how those variables affect how we do these kinds of mitzvot for one another. Okay. Moving on, source number 14, a little bit about the deadline for making Havdallah. So we know we're supposed to do it Saturday night, but when do we have until? When's the last time we can make it? Source number 14 from the tractate Psachim says, the sons of Rabbi Achia said, the one who does not make Havdallah at the close of Shabbat, until when can they make it? Until the fourth day of the week, Tuesday evening, meaning. Beginning Wednesday is like the pivot point at which we are moving towards the next Shabbat. So this would be past the point of making Havdallah for the previous Shabbat. This quality of Wednesday can also be seen in the familiar language. If you look at the Psalm for Wednesday that we say in a weekday Shacharit on a Wednesday, has some language that you might recognize from Kabbalat Shabbat. So there's also this idea of Wednesday being moving towards the next Shabbat, Tuesday being the last point that's connected to the previous Shabbat. Moving on to source number 15. One who forgot and did not make Havdallah on Saturday night can make Havdallah until the end of Tuesday. There are those who say that we do not make Havdallah except for all day Sunday and no further. And specifically, Berei Pri Hagafen and Hamavdil Ben Kodesh L'chol, however, specifically those. However, over a candle and spices, we do not make a blessing except on Saturday night. So why is that? So why would you have longer to make the blessings of the Berei Pri Hagafen, the blessing on the wine, and the blessing of Mavdil Ben Kodesh L'chol, the blessing of Havdallah? But the blessing on the candle and the besamim, you only have Saturday night. You can only do it Saturday night. So the candle and the spices, as we learned, have the qualities, certain qualities that are unique to Saturday night. therefore, we wouldn't say those two brachot at a later time, right? Like, what did we learn about that? That the spices is about restoring the spirit after we've lost the additional soul of Shabbat. That we need kind of the spiritual energy, and the candle being about remembering the first Motzei Shabbat when Adam needed light and God gave him fire. So these things are particular to Saturday evening, in a way that the separation is just about separating between Shabbat and the weekday that maybe could be done so long as we're not approaching the next Shabbat. And then finally, source 16, and then we'll open it up for questions. I thought this would be a great source to close with. So what does it say? On Motzei Shabbat, because the Talmud explains Eliyahu HaNavi cannot come on either Erev Shabbat or Erev Yom Tov because of the hassle. Rashi explains that everyone would go out to greet him and not have time to get ready for Shabbat. Therefore, now that Shabbat is over and he's able to come, we pray that he should come soon and bring us good tidings. So this is, I think, really amazing. The final part of Havdallah, maybe people have heard when I do it online on Facebook. Abra and I do. Havdallah also often sing, which is very traditional, to sing Eliyahu HaNavi after the end of doing the blessing on Havdallah. Eliyahu HaNavi, who will usher in the Messiah and the Messianic age, who we want to come as soon as feasibly as possible, but not so soon that it will disturb our Shabbat or Shabbat preparation, which is like really an amazing thing. It feels very Jewish. They're like, we want you to come, but maybe not now. We're preparing for Shabbat. We're busy. The people would all they wouldn't give proper honor to Shabbat because they'd be so busy greeting Eliyahu HaNavi if he came on Erev Shabbat before Shabbat started, or maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe they think he's coming and then they go out and they don't do their cooking and then they have no food for Shabbat. So we don't want something like that to happen. So the earliest time that he can come is Motzei Shabbat. So that's the time when we welcome him, the time that we ask for him to come, and hope and pray that he'll come. So we sing that song.